I've been recently doing a lot of deep dives on sales data, and I realized I never actually did a video about the 2023 Circana Bookscan numbers regarding sales of comic books in bookstores, not the direct market, not your local comic book shop, but at Walmart, on Amazon, at Barnes & Noble, stuff like that. And then I looked at the date and I was like, wow, I'm like a year late on this. Maybe I'll just wait for the new one to come out, and I'll incorporate the information that I have into that one. But then I looked at Tilting at Windmills, and it sounds like we will never get another Tilting at Windmills Circana Bookscan all comic book graphic novel report ever again, which was enormous and must have been exhaustive on the part of Brian Hibbs, a person I don't always agree with, but I do appreciate the amount of effort he put into that. That's probably good news for him, because when you look at it, it was clear that he was putting probably hundreds of hours into putting that thing together. It's probably good for him and his business not to be doing that, because I don't think he gets paid probably at all for Tilting at Windmills. And if he does, it ain't very much. It's not worth the amount of time he put in there. But we're going to cover it today because there was some really interesting stuff out there that really does highlight the fact that while Marvel and DC are still doing great in the direct market, I mean, they simply own it. But when it comes to the overall comic book market in America, taking into consideration not just your local comic book shop, but also all the bookstores where most of the sales are actually happening, Marvel and DC are the real indies now. And an Image and an IDW would be like the small publisher indies. It's just a different world. We've been seeing these trends happen for a long time, basically since my channel started. A few years ago was the coup de grace, where they basically became irrelevant in bookstore sales. And it only got worse in 2023. So these are my 6 enormous takeaways regarding Marvel and DC, superhero sales in the bookstore market, revealed by Circana Bookscan. Number 1, Marvel and DC have a tiny share of the bookstore market. In 2023, Marvel and DC Comics combined to account for under 10% of all graphic novel units sold through U.S. bookstores. By contrast, children's publisher Scholastic alone commanded roughly 39% of the market. Whereas comic book readers who go to the local comic book shop, we think Marvel and DC rule the roost. That is not the case when you look at the overall scheme of things and the overall sales numbers that have been driven. Marvel and DC have been relegated to the indie scene. And what's interesting is when you think about the direct market, and I believe this is happening by design for Marvel and DC and a lot of the indie publishers, that it's becoming more of a collector's market. They're not really going out there and trying to satisfy readers. They're trying to satisfy collectors by providing lots of variant covers. We're even getting variant interiors. There are lots of ratio variants. Lots of stores are doing, store exclusive variants, because I believe that they're being marketed and sold almost strictly as collectible items, like baseball cards now. $5 baseball cards. There's a story inside, but for the most part, they don't really care. Although DC has admittedly gotten better as of late. It has been doing much better, admittedly. We've talked about it here on the channel, but Marvel has not been doing so great. Whereas if you go to the bookstore chain, that is the reader's market. There's no collectability for the most part when it comes to your graphic novels and stuff like that. Yes, will there be limited print run edition hardcovers and stuff like that? Yes, that certainly plays into a collector's mindset. But for the most part, these are reader sales. This is what readers are spending their hard-earned money on, and it's not Marvel and DC anymore. It's certainly not Image. It is TMNT The Last Ronin, but that's like the big exception out there. Otherwise, they don't really make a dent in the market because they truly are the indie comic book scene. And certainly, I do want to give out credit to Comics by Perch, who coined that several years ago, but it's never been more true today than ever. Like, it's only becoming more true over time. The next big takeaway, Marvel's bookstore sales were minimal. Marvel had 1 graphic novel in Bookscan's top 750 sellers for 2023, a Spider-Punk collection ranked around 557 with roughly 12,000 copies sold. Tellingly, even this lone Marvel published title was outsold by Marvel content released through other publishers. For example, Viz, Scholastic, Disney, and Abrams each had Marvel-related books with higher sales than any Marvel published book, which is embarrassing. There's like no other way to put it. They had 1 book in the entire top 750. 750, that's a long list, and it's Spider-Punk. And the only reason that was on there because they had that Spider-Verse movie. Spider-Punk was in it. They decided to check it out. Unfortunately, that volume of Spider-Punk was written by Cody Ziegler and is absolutely awful. And if that was ever somebody's first like comic book they ever received, they probably would never read comic books again. That's how bad it was. But the fact that other people can put Marvel characters on the cover and do Marvel titles not written by Marvel that sell better than Marvel is a clear example that Marvel does not get this market whatsoever. They do not know how to do anything with it. You even look at like their evergreen titles, like their cool stories that are out there. You know, DC does not have this problem, but where's Infinity Gauntlet? Where is the Galactus trilogy? You know, where are these classic stories that are out there? Because they do have them. Gore the God Butcher, pretty cool stuff. There are really cool Marvel stories out there. You know, where's freaking Iron Man Extremis and all that? None of it's ever there. They don't understand the market. They don't understand what stories they have that are going to appeal to people, and they certainly don't know how to package them and put them out there and actually be successful in the bookstore market. The only reason Spider-Punk was successful is because of a movie that was made by Sony. It wasn't even made by Disney. It had nothing to do with Marvel Comics. It just happened to feature characters of theirs that drew interest. Why wasn't Marvel creating projects that would appeal to that Across the Spider-Verse audience for Miles Morales to elevate the character, maybe generate some sales? They don't even think about this stuff, and that's why Marvel is essentially persona non grata in bookstores. Yes, you're going to have a section with Marvel titles, and they'll be all different shapes and sizes, and it won't even make any sense, and nobody even looks at them. They just don't sell almost at all within bookstores, despite ruling the roost in your LCS. Now for the next big takeaway. DC comic sales hit a low point. DC bookstore performance plummeted in 2023, with unit sales down about 25% year over year, the company's weakest showing in bookstores since 2004. Only 14 DC titles made the top 750 in 2023, a drastic drop from 130 DC books in the top 75 a decade earlier in 2013, highlighting how much DC's presence in bookstores has eroded. And the weird thing is, when you look at a lot of those DC books, it's Watchmen, it's Dark Knight Returns, it's The Killing Joke. It's all those like really classic, mostly Batman stories, like even Court of Owls is a more recent one. Probably the Batman, the Three Jokers in there as well. But a lot of their modern stuff really isn't hitting. Like, they have more stuff that hits than Marvel, but not nearly as much as they should, considering everything that they do and Marvel does is literally written for the trade. It's literally written to be released in trade paperback form, so it'll be easily consumable and the story will all make sense in the trade paperback, not how they were writing it 30 years ago, and they still aren't doing well. And DC at one point did rule the bookstore market. Unfortunately for them, manga did come in, the rise and proliferation of Scholastic as a publisher, and they've only been doing this for like 15 years, I think. It's not like Scholastic has any history when you compare it to like a DC Comics has been around for over 80 years. Marvel Comics has been around for over 80 years, and they just absolutely have dominated and stolen the market from DC Comics. And I think a lot of that has to do with that emphasis on collectibles rather than stories, and people aren't going to their bookstore for throwaway stories that were never really meant to be consumed, that were supposed to just be vehicles for different covers and collectors to buy 15 copies of the exact same comic book. And it's even hitting DC, and they are seeing record lows as far as their influence in the bookstore channel. And once again, they are becoming the indies, or they have become. They've been relegated to being the indies of the bookstore channel, which is unfortunate because that's where the vast majority of comic book sales in America actually happen. Next big takeaway, superhero titles barely cracked the top sellers list. Mainstream American superhero comics were largely absent from the upper ranks of the bookstore sales in 2023. The highest charting Marvel or DC superhero graphic novel was DC's Watchmen, an evergreen classic, at approximately 305 on 2023's year sale chart at approximately 24,000 copies sold. Marvel's first appearance didn't occur until 557 with the Spider-Punk trade at approximately 12,000 copies. In fact, only 6 of the top 100 best-selling graphic novels in bookstores were American comics aimed at adults, and none of those 6 were contemporary Marvel or DC superhero storylines. In fact, TMNT The Last Ronin is the big aberration. And I believe that's I think it's actually 3 of the 6 American superhero comic books that show up to the top 100 are freaking TMNT The Last Ronin, which is a great story. And it shows that there is an appetite out there for American readers for superhero comic books, for characters that they're familiar with, but you have to have an awesome story. TMNT The Last Ronin is an awesome story. You got Kevin Eastman coming back, doing layouts, doing some of the art in there, original concept from Eastman and Laird, so you know it's not bullshit, woke, mainstream crap that we've been getting that's infused with the message in no good story. You know, it's got really great art out there by the Escorza brothers, and it ended up being a huge hit. And not surprisingly, it translated not well, but brilliantly over to the bookstore channel. Now, things will probably get a little bit better in 2024. Unfortunately, we won't get that sales chart ranking analysis because Hibbs isn't going to be able to do that because of new rules by Circana Bookscan. But I do believe DC's compact comic line will make a big difference, or probably did make a big difference. We know that they were regularly charting up and competing with manga comic book sales because people were very interested in that format with those titles. The unfortunate part is it's mostly all the evergreen stuff that was already selling. It's Watchmen, it's Dark Knight Returns, it's Batman Year One type stuff. A bunch of really awesome titles that always sell. They put it in a new format, and shockingly, it sold once again. They need to start making stories like that. Unfortunately, you got to have the creative punch. You got to have that force behind your publisher. And Marvel and DC just don't have that these days. But every once in a while, you will get a book like TMNT The Last Ronin that absolutely puts a dent and makes a mark and goes up there and actually competes with the best-selling manga titles on a given year. Another takeaway, traditional comic publishers are dwarfed by Scholastic and bookstores. The combined 2023 sales of all major U.S. direct market publishers and bookstores, including Marvel, DC, Image, Dark Horse, Boom, Dynamite, and IDW, amounted to under 750,000 copies total. For the top 750 rankings, that is roughly 1/10 of Scholastic's volume in the top 750, as Scholastic alone sold on the order of 8.5 million copies to the bookstore channel in 2023. In other words, superhero and traditional comic publishers collectively make up a sliver of graphic novel sales compared to kid-focused publishers in bookstores. And it's probably even way worse than that because I don't believe the Scholastic book fair sales are incorporated in that. And they go out, I think, basically to every school, and they sell these books directly to kids, not through the bookstore channel. So just through the bookstore numbers, Scholastic is the big dog. A lot of that powered by Dav Pilkey and Dogman and Catman and, all that Diary of a Wimpy Kid kind of stuff, which are really great. I've got 3 kids, and I've got all the American comic book superheroes, DC, Marvel, that they could ever want, but we've also got them Dogman. Obviously, we've got them Diary of a Wimpy Kid. We've got The Last Kids on Earth. Guess which books they read? They go and read the stuff that's being done by Scholastic and some of those other kids publishers, and they've made Marvel and DC and all the other indie publishers in the American superhero comic book industry essentially irrelevant. They don't even get shelf space. Basically, they get one bookcase in a Barnes and Noble combined for all of them, and then Scholastic gets a freaking wall, and Manga gets a wall. And it's pretty crazy when you look at it and you think about it, where the industry was 20 years ago and how much it's changed since then. And the fact that Marvel and DC essentially have done nothing to change along with it, despite being the market leaders. Certainly Marvel is the market leader, and nobody has done anything to try to recapture this market, to really compete in this market. The only thing that we've seen that's made a difference is producing classic stories that have always sold in a size format more approximate to manga. And while that's a good idea, and I'm glad that they're evolving with the industry, they're going to have to do more than that if they're ever going to take back some of this bookstore shelf space when it comes to graphic novel sales. The final big takeaway I had from the 2023 Circana Bookscan numbers: comic shop versus bookstore, a stark contrast. In the comic store direct market, Marvel and DC still dominate. Marvel is described as the 800-pound gorilla with the majority of direct market sales. However, this dominance does not translate to bookstores, and the bookstore data is far more transparent. Direct market sales figures are less reliable. Diamond Comics halted public sales reports during the pandemic, so the Bookscan numbers underscore how little market share Marvel and DC superhero titles have in general retail settings outside of comic book shops. So Certainly Marvel and DC still rule the local comic book shop. When you go to the direct market, it's Marvel and DC and then everything else, including Manga and Dogman and all the other indie publishers out there. But when you get into the actual reader's market, the almost strictly reader's market, the bookstore itself, despite Marvel and DC writing for the trades for 15 years now, none of that is working. They are basically a blip on the radar, an afterthought when you get into that market. Thankfully, the direct market is still there, and we're all enormous supporters of the local comic book shops. But hopefully, Marvel and DC will get off this comic books are collectibles. They aren't entertainment. They're not actually meant to be read train that they've been doing for several years now, and get into the mindset that there's a bigger market out there. We don't have to just stay in the direct market. I want local comic book shops to stick around. I love the direct market, but there's another place to find an audience. And if they get in there and they find those great stories and they figure out that there's great runs of Green Lantern going on, Superman, Aliens versus Avengers, if you want to go with Marvel, and then they'll find their way over to the direct market to find some of those more obscure titles that maybe there isn't shelf space for in something like a Barnes & Noble. There's never going to be enough shelf space for everything in a Barnes & Noble, but the direct market, you can see all those great superheroes. And there should be a steady flow from the bookstore to the direct market. That's how this would be working if the comic book industry, when I say comic book industry, I'm talking about American comic book publishers, Marvel, DC, superhero stuff, was working properly and was really healthy. It sounds like it might be getting healthier. We'll see how all that goes. But once more, a stark reminder that Marvel and DC are truly the minor leagues when it comes to comic book sales. And that's the way it's been for several years now, and I don't see that turning around anytime soon until Marvel and DC look at these numbers, stare reality in the face, and realize the market passed us by and we need to catch up. But they really haven't done that. If you appreciate this kind of honest analysis that you can only get of the comic book industry right here on Think Critical YouTube, and you'd like to be part of the family, help us keep the lights on, the videos flowing forward, the best place to do that is Think Critical Patreon. There's a link in the video description. There's a button right here. You find the right tier for you. You get awesome bonus podcasts. You get to support the family, and you get to keep the mission moving forward. Hope to see you there very, very soon.